an hour or so, and then we will take questions that we have questions that we've received ahead of time, but I'll just ask some questions that have occurred to me. I read your book today, Matthew.
Good.
I'd read reviews of it before, that's why I invited you, but I read the whole thing now, and it's quite interesting. And I actually I take your point of view on this, which makes it a less contentious conversation. But I'll try to challenge you a little bit here. But
wonderful.
Welcome everybody this evening with our special guest, Dr. Matthew Kroenig. I am Andrew Natsios, the director of the Scowcroft Institute, and I'm happy to host you all here for this Zoom talk this evening. Dr. Kroenig will speak on his book, The Return of Great Power Rivalry, Democracy versus Autocracy from the Ancient World to the US and China. Dr. Kroenig is a professor of government and foreign service at Georgetown University. I think I came in 2006 to Georgetown. You came in 2008. So you're just almost the same time. But you've become quite famous actually since. I have retired into obscurity, some people think, but
I'm not sure about that, but
so he is also the deputy director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security in 2019. By the way, the Scowcroft Center is at the Atlantic Council. The Scowcroft Institute is at the Bush School. We are sister organizations, but separate organizations. We're not rivals, though, Matthew. I don't think we're not rivals. He is author. He is in 2019 in Perspectives on Politics. They ranked him as one of the top 25 most cited political scientists of his generation. He's the author and editor of 7 books and articles. They've appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Politico, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. He's been on all of the major TV stations. He previously served in several positions in the US government, including the Strategy Office in the Office of Secretary of Defense and the Strategic Assessment Group at the Central Intelligence Agency. He regularly consults with a range of US government entities. He has previously worked as a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow, the Council on Foreign Relations, where he is a lifetime member. He has had grants from the National Science Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, Smith Richardson, Hertog, and Stanton. He has a master's degree and PhD from University of California at Berkeley. Join me in welcoming my good friend, Matthew Kroenig from Georgetown University. Matthew?
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Professor Natsios. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you to all of you for coming out and spending your evening with us. And I just wish I could be there in person in College Station, but look forward to the possibility of doing that sometime in the future. And I guess it's especially nice that, as was mentioned, I'm at the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council to be speaking at the Scowcroft Institute, different organizations, but we both honor the legacy of General Brent Scowcroft, only person to serve as National Security Advisor to 2 presidents, widely seen as the best National Security Advisor in US history. So I was invited tonight to speak about my book, The Return of Great Power Rivalry, Democracy versus Autocracy from the Ancient World to the United States and China. Great power rivalry has been a part of international politics from the beginning of time. But we had this remarkable, really 25-year period after the end of the Cold War where it seemed like great power competition had ended. And it's hard to believe now, but the 2010 National Security Strategy published under the Obama administration mentioned Russia and China quite a bit, but never once mentioned them as possible threats, mentioned them as possible partners for climate change, arms control, and other issues. But the world has changed quite a bit in the past 10 years. Russia and China have become more aggressive. And the 2017 National Security Strategy of the United States has declared that the return of great power rivalry with Russia, but especially China, is the greatest threat to US national security. And the Biden administration has continued this emphasis. Secretary of State Tony Blinken has said that China poses the greatest state-based threat to the United States, the only threat that could potentially undermine the rules-based international system. So what will be the outcome of this competition? Will the United States and its democratic allies, are we positioned well? Or are we going to be, US global leadership, is it going to be disrupted or displaced by these autocratic challenges from Russia and China? There's something of a conventional wisdom, I think, in Washington, which is that we're in trouble in this competition. Democracies are dysfunctional, polarized, gridlocked. Look at the impeachment, look at January 6th. Meanwhile, our autocratic competitors are efficient. President Xi, President Putin can make big, bold decisions, plan for the long term, engage in long-term strategic thinking. So they're going to be well positioned to disrupt or displace us. And so I was skeptical of this argument. I thought that people were underappreciating American strengths and maybe seeing our adversaries as 10 foot tall when that wasn't really the case. And it's one of the things that motivated me to write this book. And so I do conclude that actually democracies have built-in advantages in long-run competitions like this. Despite our challenges, and we do have challenges in the United States, our fundamentals are still stronger than Russia's and China's, and the United States is better positioned to remain the world's leading state for years to come. So that's what I want to talk about over the next 25 minutes or so. And in fact, I have some slides that I can maybe share to help us walk through the argument. So let me share my screen. There's an image of the book that it's been doing quite well. It was the #1 new release in international relations at Amazon for several weeks upon its publication. And last time I checked, it was still in the top 10. So for an academic, that's not bad. I think some of my previous scholarly books sold 3 copies to me, my mom, and the university library. The question that motivated this is the United States going to retain its position as the world's most powerful country? It's been the world's most powerful country since 1945, but many are predicting that time is over. And so it really raises a more fundamental question in international relations theory. Why do countries amass power and influence while others don't? Why do some countries become major powers? Why do they become the leading state in the international system? And again, the conclusion is I think democracies are pretty good at this. And given that the United States is well positioned to be the world's leading state for the foreseeable future. So return of great power rivalry, you're probably all familiar, but Russia and China have become more assertive in the past decade or so. And starting with Russia, of course, invaded its neighbor Georgia in 2008, invaded Ukraine in 2014, intervened militarily in Syria in 2015, making Russia a major power broker in the Middle East for the first time, really since the 1970s. Russia has also been interfering in Western democracies, interfering in the US presidential election, but not just the United States, doing that also in other countries in Europe, seeking to, and to a great degree, having success in dividing us against each other and dividing us against our allies. But the biggest challenge, I think, comes from China. China has had remarkable economic growth over the past several decades. It's now the second largest economy on earth after the United States. And some economists predict that China will overtake the United States as the world's leading power in the next decade or so. And China's been investing that economic power into diplomatic and military influence. Its Belt and Road Initiative is ostensibly an effort to invest in bridges, ports, roads, to kind of resurrect the old Silk Road trading routes, but is really a kind of Chinese grand strategy to increase Chinese influence in every region on Earth. And military capabilities, taking contested territory from its neighbors, including in the South China Sea. And you can see an image of one of the islands that China has taken from its neighbors in the region, and shifting the military balance of power in Asia. And US military planners really wonder whether the United States has the ability to protect longstanding partners in the Indo-Pacific, including Taiwan. So if Russia is successfully disrupting US leadership, some fear that China may displace US leadership, that China might become the world's leading power. So we were somewhat slow to awaken to this challenge, but as I mentioned before, by the National Security Strategy of 2017, National Defense Strategy of 2018, we recognize that this is the biggest threat facing the country. Kind of a required slide for an academic. The academic question here really is, why do some countries amass power and wealth and others don't? Why do some countries become major powers? Why do some countries become the leading powers? Why do they decline? Why are they overtaken by other states? And so this is kind of the required slide to say international relations scholars have been obsessed with power, but recent scholars haven't really focused on this question of world domination. Why do some countries dominate the world and others don't? Maybe for understandable reasons. But this is a question that was interesting to political theorists of previous generations. So Polybius, Montesquieu, Machiavelli are all political theorists who looked at this question: why do some countries become world leaders and others don't? And they all came to the same conclusion, which is democracies, or as they sometimes referred to them, republican with a small r, republican systems are more likely to become world leaders, and dictatorships are less likely. And so if you know anything about these theorists, you might be surprised to hear this about Machiavelli. Because Machiavelli was famous for his book, The Prince, which is essentially a handbook for dictators, saying that leaders should engage in whatever ruthless activity they need to, lying, stealing, assassination, war, in order to protect themselves in a dangerous world. But one of my hardship posts at Georgetown every year, well, at least every year until the pandemic, I taught a 2-week course in Florence, Italy on Machiavelli. And so I think Machiavelli's better book is called The Discourses on Livy. And Discourses on Livy is really a full-throated defense of democratic systems of government. I have a couple of young children. If you can hear that in the background, my apologies. And Machiavelli was really obsessed with the question of how did Rome become the most powerful country in the ancient world? And his conclusion was pretty simple. It was the Roman Republic. It was the Republican institutions that allowed Rome to rise from being a small city-state on the Tiber River to dominating the entire Mediterranean basin. And so, he's actually right about the timing. Many of us think about the Roman Empire, but actually the greatest explosion of wealth and power was under the Republic. And it was only after the transition to empire that Rome then began its long and slow decline. So in a way, what I'm doing in this book is kind of updating some of these arguments about dominant democracies from the ancient world and applying it to the present. And so I start with kind of a simple intuition, which is in order for a country to be strong internationally, it needs to be strong in 3 major ways. It needs to have a strong economy, it needs to have a strong diplomacy, and it needs to be strong militarily. If you're strong economically, you can promise trade and investment to your friends, you can threaten sanctions and tariffs against your enemies. If you're strong militarily, you can promise to protect your friends, you can threaten to hurt your enemies. And if you have a lot of allies and friends diplomatically, it's easier to accomplish things. If the rest of the world is gaining up against you, it's harder to do that. And so the question then becomes, are democracies or autocracies better able to gain economic, diplomatic, and military strength? So one of the other things I do for Georgetown is I teach a PhD seminar in advanced international relations theory. And international relations scholars, economists, have really been obsessed with this question of why do democracies or autocracies have an advantage? And they've looked in a number of discrete areas and found essentially that it seems like democracies do at least a little bit better in a lot of these areas. And so I have the benefit of standing on the shoulders of giants and essentially aggregating up these smaller findings into a bigger argument about democratic fitness in international politics. So I'll just go through some of this quickly, but a lot of economists and political economists have found advantages for democracies. They tend to have higher long-run rates of economic growth. They tend to put in place better economic institutions. They actually have property rights and courts and other things that can enforce contracts and give people an incentive to engage in economic activity. They tend to be better at innovation. They encourage people to think outside the box, be risk takers. engage in entrepreneurship. They tend to be more open to international trade. They're just more comfortable with people, goods, ideas, services flowing across their borders. Autocracies like control. They like controlling what comes across their borders, and so that makes them more closed to trade. They're better able to raise debt and have a financial advantage in general. So I don't know if any of you have retirement accounts, or maybe your parents do. I'm guessing they don't have a lot of money in Russia and China. I'm guessing they invest in the S&P 500 and US Treasury bonds. And that's not an unusual phenomenon. The Russians and the Chinese are investing in the US economy as well. Really, since the beginning of capital, people have found their investments to be safer in democratic, more open systems of government than in autocracies. So a pretty serious set of economic advantages: better economic institutions, better innovation, better long-run growth, more open to trade, better financial centers. Now, some of you might already be asking, well, what about the exceptions? What about China? Hasn't it had a remarkable growth? And what some of these economists like Acemoglu and Robinson say is that, yes, autocracies and state-led planning can be effective in the short term. If you're allocating resources from an unproductive area to a more productive area, you can get a short-term spike in growth. And they argue that's essentially what China has done by moving masses of peasants from agriculture into the city to engage in manufacturing. But they say that state-led planning has a hard time making these bets over and over again. Market economies do much better. And so they predict that China will run out of steam, and I agree with them on that. Political science literature on alliances, and finding that democracies build larger, more reliable alliances. And just as one example, think about NATO, 30 formal treaty allies. It's grown over time, has lasted for decades. And when one of the members was attacked on 9/11, the rest of the members came to the United States defense. Now let's compare that to an autocratic alliance, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Warsaw Pact. In both of these cases, actually, allies fought each other. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed an alliance and then went to war against each other. The Soviet Union established the Warsaw Pact and invaded its own members, Czechoslovakia and Hungary. So autocracies don't have a great record of building trusting alliances. And political scientists don't have many laws, but one of the things that I think we know is that democracies are more likely to make and keep their commitments of all kinds. Beth Simmons at University of Pennsylvania has done a lot of research on this: human rights treaties, trade agreements, alliances, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. If you look at the countries that are cheating on their treaties, it's almost always all autocracies. Democracies keep their commitments for the most part. Soft power, Joseph Nye, a professor at Harvard University, has written about the importance of soft power. Basically, the ability to get other countries to want what you want because your culture, your policies, your institutions are attractive. The University of Southern California does a ranking, the so-called Soft Power 30. What are the countries with the most soft power in the world? The top 20 countries in their list are all democracies. Russia and China make the list, but it's near the bottom. China's 27 and Russia's 30. And then an argument I make, I think for the first time in this book, is that doing this historical analysis, I find that autocracies, when they gain power and influence, the rest of the world starts to get nervous and gangs up against them. So you can think about Xerxes, Napoleon, Hitler, President Xi today. For some reason, when democracies become powerful, other countries are not as concerned. So a pretty serious set of diplomatic advantages. And then finally, military advantages. And again, I'm standing on the shoulder of giants, but a couple of political scientists, Dan Ryder and Alan Stam, wrote a good book on who wins wars. And they found from 1815 to the present, democracies have won 75% of the wars that they've fought. On the other hand, autocracies lose more than they win. So just empirically, we know democracies win more of their wars. Why is that the case? And they think there are two reasons. They think that democratic leaders make better decisions on war and peace. Not that it's always, not that they don't make mistakes, but because there's public debate, because there's checks and balances within their governments, they're more likely to understand the risks of war before they head down that road. On the other hand, autocracies and dictators often don't hear that kind of conflicting advice. You know, Saddam Hussein used to literally shoot people who gave him bad news in the head. And so if you do that once or twice, people are going to stop giving you bad news. And so dictators tend to make worse decisions. They also argued that democratic soldiers are more effective on the battlefield. They're more likely to take initiative when conditions change. Whereas autocratic soldiers, it's safer to sit back and wait for orders from above. You don't want to do anything that's going to irritate your superiors. Perhaps the most important military advantage for democracies, though, is simply that they don't fear their own people. And autocracies from time immemorial, the greatest threat they face is from their own people. They're afraid of coups, insurrections, rebellions, civil war. And so they spend a lot of their time repressing their own people. And this is true today. Russia and China spend more on internal security than on their militaries. For the United States, it's 2-to-1 in the other direction. So if you just follow the money, the Chinese are more afraid of Uyghurs in Xinjiang and protesters in Hong Kong than they are of the US Department of Defense. So that's a pretty serious set of military advantages as well. So basically, adding this all up, if democracies are doing a little bit better economically, diplomatically, and militarily, shouldn't they be doing better overall in international politics? And so here's kind of a schematic of the argument. And I'll just use this to say, often in the United States, we debate what is the greatest source of our strength? Is it our world-beating economy, Wall Street, Silicon Valley? Is it our global network of allies and partners? Or is it our superpower, power-projecting military? And the argument of this book really is that all of those things are actually reflections of our domestic political institutions. We're strong economically, we're strong diplomatically, and we're strong militarily because of our Republican or Democratic, both small r, small d system of government. Now, this isn't the only point of view. Throughout history, people have argued that maybe autocracies have the advantage, including Plato, Alexander de Tocqueville, even Henry Kissinger. And we're hearing a version of this argument reemerge today. And I hear this in Washington, that autocracies like President Xi can make bold, rapid decisions. Meanwhile, we're gridlocked and polarized. Thomas Friedman, columnist for the New York Times, made this argument and said, had a column 10 years or so ago that said, wouldn't it be nice to be China for a day? They can do what they need to do. They invest in infrastructure and climate change, and we can't get anything done. The other argument is autocracies engage in long-run planning. China has a plan for 2049. We're focused on the next election. They also argue that autocracies are unconstrained. International politics is a brutal place. They can murder, lie, assassinate if they need to. And we're constrained by norms, by laws. And then, at least from the outside, they appear stable. We have impeachment and controversies playing out on CNN every day. So I argue in the book that actually all these arguments are either incorrect or have, there's another side to the coin. So autocracies can make big, bold decisions, and that's great if it's the right decision. When it's the bad decision, they invade Russia in the winter, and it doesn't turn out so well. I actually argue it's not the case that autocracies are better at long-run planning. Since dictators are unconstrained, they can bounce around from one failed policy to another. I think we've seen that with Mao Zedong in China. I think we're seeing it with Xi today. And I argue in the book essentially that the United States has had the same grand strategy since 1945, kind of building and maintaining and defending this rules-based international system. Autocracies might have some advantages from being ruthless, but there's also a downside. If nobody trusts your word, that's a pretty serious downside. Nobody trusts Russia and China when they say they're going to abide by arms control agreements, ceasefires, and nobody trusts that their vaccines are effective, at least initially. They need to prove it. And autocratic politics are only clean from the outside. There's still politicking going on. It just happens in torture chambers. We have the benefit of being transparent. It's playing out on CNN. You see what you get, warts and all. Final possibility, maybe there's no difference. And this is something that so-called realist international relations scholars have argued. And they say if one of these systems were more effective, it's a Darwinian struggle of the fittest. The other system would have been eliminated from international politics. Given that we still have both, they both must be able to do what it takes to survive in a dangerous system. Okay, we have three possibilities. Maybe democracies are better, maybe autocracies are better, maybe there's no difference. So let's look at the evidence. And one of the things that was remarkable to me writing this book is reminding myself just how rare democracy has been throughout world history. By 1945, there are only about a dozen or so democracies in the world. Yet democracies have almost always been among the world's leading states. Athens was the world's first democracy and became a leader of the Greeks. Rome, the world's first republic, became the most powerful country maybe in the history of the world. The Dutch Republic, the first republic in early modern Europe, became a global superpower. Britain, the United States, and so on. And so political scientists, some political scientists talk about this long cycle theory of international relations where you have the rise and fall of great powers over time. And so these scholars have, in every year, have said, what is the world's system leader? And some of the leading scholars in this area have said that the system leader in 1609 to 1713 was the Dutch Republic, then Great Britain, and then the United States until the present. And don't let that 1985 date fool you. That's when the study was done, but it's been updated to the present. All these countries were, according to our best assessments, either the most or among the most democratic countries in the world at the time. So a 400-year history of global domination is not a bad record. And some of you might know political science is becoming more like economics. There's pressure on us to do kind of quantitative analysis. And so I do some quantitative analysis in the book, and I show that there are correlations between countries that are more democratic and how much power they have in the international system. Maybe the most interesting part of the book for some people, I do a series of 7 case studies between autocratic and democratic rivals, starting with the Greeks and the Persians 2,500 years ago, all the way up through the end of the Cold War. And I obviously can't review all these case studies here. I'd recommend you to check out the book if you're interested. But it's kind of continual pattern of democracies doing really well in these competitions, and for the precise reasons identified in a theoretical framework. They tend to be innovative, trading powers. They tend to become the capital of capital, kind of centers of international finance. They tend to be good at building alliances and partnerships, and tend to be pretty powerful militarily, often with powerful navies. On the other hand, the autocracies tend to lose these rivalries. And again, for the same reasons. They have economic problems, they default on their debt, they're bad at building alliances, the rest of the world gangs up against them, and they they either start wars that they lose disastrously or have domestic political instability issues. Again, can't go through all these. Athens, maybe you're familiar with, the Roman Republic. Venice was an interesting one for me. I've been to Venice many times and always thought about it as a kind of quaint tourist destination. But in the 1200s, it was a superpower. It was the center of international finance. It had the largest navy on earth. It was probably the wealthiest country on earth and controlled territory throughout the Middle East and as far away as Russia. Dutch Republic, also an interesting one for me. And essentially, I think the British and the Americans followed the example built by the Dutch Republic. It was the center of international finance, the world's largest trading power, effective at building alliances, innovative militarily with a powerful navy and a global empire. And we know the British and the American cases. All right, so what does this mean for where we are today and the great power rivalry among the US, Russia, and China? Well, Russia is really an easy case for the argument. It's a prototypical example of a corrupt and inefficient autocracy. Its economy is smaller than Spain's and Italy's. We don't consider Spain and Italy great powers, and we shouldn't. And so Russia isn't a great power economically. Diplomatically, it's not a great power either. And in fact, it's terrible at building alliances and fights wars with its allies more than alongside them. And two recent examples, Georgia and Ukraine were members of the Commonwealth of Independent States when they were invaded by Russia. Russia's been better at undermining our alliances, but not good at building its own. Militarily, Russia's been punching above its weight, but it's just going to be constrained by economic limits, and we're already seeing that. And its military spending has declined in each of the past 3 years. Now, China's maybe the harder case, and people say, hasn't China cracked the code on how to have an efficient autocracy, the so-called state-led model of capitalism? And indeed, China has gained ground, and I don't want to deny that. It's the world's second largest economy, gaining influence diplomatically through its Belt and Road Initiative, and shifting the military balance of power in Asia. Yet when we look closer, I think we see that China does have the weaknesses we've seen from autocracies historically. So economically, President Xi is prioritizing political control over economic performance, and the Chinese economy is suffering because of it. They've actually backtracked on 8 of the 10 areas where the party itself has promised reforms. You know, economists say that China is going to overtake the United States in 10 years. Just to remind everyone, economists were saying 10 years ago that China would overtake the United States in 10 years. It hasn't happened. I suspect 10 years from now, they'll say in 10 years, and that the real answer may very well be never, that China will never become the world's leading economy. Diplomatically, we're seeing the kind of counterbalancing coalition form against China that I think we saw against Xerxes, Hitler, Napoleon, and others in the past. The United States has declared China its foremost rival. The European Union has declared China a systemic rival. We see this quad of powers forming in Asia, Australia, Japan, India, and the United States balancing against China. So I think the rest of the world is beginning to gang up against China. And then militarily, I could go into some detail, but I think most importantly is China's domestic concerns. It's spending more on repressing its people than on its military. So here's an example of China's Belt and Road investments. Here's data from the Asia Society about how China's backtracking on its promised economic reforms, basically killing the goose that laid the golden egg for China. Example I talk about in the book, China claims it's going to be a military and technology innovator. China still hasn't figured out how to do nuclear deterrence patrols with submarines. This is a 1960s technology for the United States. China still can't do it in 2021. Here's the biggest threat to the Chinese Communist Party, not the Pentagon, but protesters in Hong Kong and Uyghurs. All right, so the United States, I think an easy argument for my book, and we often get pessimistic, but the United States has been the world's leading economy since the 1890s, still the global leader in finance, has been the world's innovation leader since the time of Thomas Edison. And I think it's still in a strong position in all these areas. Diplomatically, the United States has over 30 formal treaty allies. Combined with our allies, we possess 59% of global GDP, so still a preponderance of global power. And then militarily, we're still the only global power projecting superpower. And when people talk about how we might lose a war with Russia and China, I agree with them. I'm worried about that. But let's remind ourselves that the fear is that China or Russia is going to invade a small US ally on their border, and the United States will have a hard time defending them. And that is a real challenge. But these aren't symmetrical situations. We're not worried about Russia and China projecting military power in great numbers into North America and threatening countries on the United States border or the United States directly. So to some degree, the fact that we worry about these wars with small allies on China and Russia's border is evidence of our overwhelming military power. Share of global GDP, US still in a commanding lead. Some areas, the US economic advantage over China is actually growing, including in private wealth, innovation leadership, military leadership. All right, so let me wrap up. What does this mean for how we think about international relations theory? Well, essentially, this is the hard power case for democracy. We often defend democracy because it's good for freedom and human rights, and that's true. But studying this book, I really think democracy is the best machine ever invented for generating enormous power and wealth on the international stage. What are the implications for policy? Well, I think despite a lot of the pessimism that the United States is well positioned to maintain its position as the world's leading state, we do face serious challenges from Russia and China, but it's not a challenge that they'll overtake the United States as the world leader. It's that they can cause some trouble. After all, democracies beat Hitler, but we had to fight a world war to do it. If I'm right that it's America's institutions that's our greatest strength, then we do need to get our own house in order and take seriously concerns about the decline of American democracy. Contrary to this idea that we can't do grand strategy, I think we've done the same grand strategy since 1945, building this rules-based international system. But the system is facing new challenges. It's not 1945 anymore. I think we need to revitalize and adapt the system for a new era. What if we want to get tougher with Russia and China? And I think often in the national security community, we focus on our weaknesses and the enemy's strengths, and that makes sense. We want to, we don't want to be surprised. But I think often good strategy comes from the opposite. It's about thinking about our strengths and the enemy's weaknesses, and how can we stick it to them there. And I think this book shows what our strengths are and what the enemy's weaknesses are. And so finally, just to conclude, I think the real challenge here isn't in Washington, it's for Beijing and Moscow. If President Xi and President Putin want to hang on to power, leave office only in a coffin, they can do that, but I think it means that they're going to be destined to rule over dysfunctional second-tier powers. On the other hand, if they're sincere in wanting their countries to become great powers and world leaders, then I think the solution is obvious. They need to give up power, and they need to put in place the kind of democratic systems that we've seen have been prerequisites for international leadership from the ancient world to today for the past 2,500 years. So I think I'll end my remarks there and very much look forward to Q&A and discussion.
Thank you, Matthew. Let me just ask sort of an initial question of placing yourself. Georgetown is a center of liberal internationalism on the faculty. At least that's my impression. I was a development person, so we're a little bit outside the debate, but a lot of the students complained about it actually to me, that there were no realists on, or very few realists on the faculty. I always actually didn't think of you as a liberal internationalist. I thought of you as a conservative internationalist. I mean, center right, not, I use those terms carefully. Donald Trump was not a center, was not a conservative internationalist. He was something very different. And that's another question. But would you place you were very critical of structural realists in the book, as in my view, you should be. But then there's the culturalist argument. There is the culture clash argument of Sam Huntington, and there are other schools. Where would you place yourself in all of these different schools of international relations theory? Are you a liberal internationalist?
It's a good question, and I'm teaching an intro to IR course right now. So I'm going through liberalism, realism, constructivism. A couple of years ago, if somebody had asked me, I would have said, I think I'm a realist. I think power is important in international politics. It's an anarchic international system. Great powers matter. Doing the research for this book and the next book I'm working on, I do think the liberal internationalists were onto something. I think there is something about democracy, free trade, institutions. And so I think of myself as something of a hybrid of realist and liberal internationalist. And so I think the liberal internationalists don't appreciate military power enough. So I think that's where they get it wrong. But I think they're right that institutions, democracy, and trade matter. And I think the realists are too focused on threats. But okay, you've defended the threats. Then what is it you're trying to build in the world? What is it you're trying to accomplish? And so I think I've become something of an amalgam. And my next book I'm working on now, tentative title is something like Force for Good, How American Power Has Made the World Safer, Richer, and Freer. And it is also kind of an amalgam that basically, it's American military power that has allowed us to create this kind of liberal international system that I do think has brought the world really unprecedented peace, prosperity, and freedom.
Well, actually, I was going to just ask you that question because I have worked with the international system as a development professional over 30 years. And it is indisputable that there's been a massive improvement in life for the great bulk of humanity since World War II, but particularly since 1980. Part of that's globalization, but it's also part of the UN system, the World Bank. I mean, they have deep flaws. I've worked with them all. Liberal internationalists almost act as though there are no weaknesses in these institutions, and there are. My observation, these institutions don't work without American leadership. So in fact, the liberal internationalists are wrong when they say that rules-based international order on its own is going to function. It's not going to function at all without the United States. And it's interesting, Guterres, the Secretary General, former Prime Minister of Portugal and High Commissioner for Refugees, who said exactly that publicly more than once. He said that international system and organizations do not work without American leadership. And I think that's my observation as a practitioner, is that's absolutely true. And I don't know what that, how the liberal internationalists would deal with that issue. How do they deal with the dysfunctions of the international organizational system that the United States is constantly pressing to try to improve?
Yeah, I think we're on the same page on this one, and I tend to focus a little bit more on security and defense issues, but NATO is another good example. Without the United States, NATO is not an effective military alliance. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, I think, is another example. If it hadn't been for the United States playing a lead role in negotiating the treaty, enforcing the treaty, I'm not sure that it would be nearly as effective as it has been.
Now, I have to say that the political system as it's arrayed now, with the progressive left attacking globalization and the populist right attacking globalization. In fact, I've said it to them and get really angry when I say it, that they actually agree on more than they disagree with. And they hate each other, but they also are like each other. The progressive left is isolationist in many respects. They wouldn't use that term, but they are. And the notion of American leadership in the world, really, they think it's sort of an imperialist threat to even use that term. And the populist right says, well, we shouldn't be doing it anyway because it's bad for America. How do you answer those two extremes, which actually have a powerful force within both political parties right now?
Yeah, often in the United States, we think about the left-right divides, and we're so polarized. When it comes to foreign policy, I think the real debate is center versus extremes. I'm not sure that Anthony Blinken and H.R. McMaster actually disagree on that much. Blinken somewhat center-left, McMaster, I think, center-right. But they both disagree with Rand Paul. They both disagree with Bernie Sanders. Yet Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul agree on quite a bit. We need to get out of these forever wars in the Middle East, for example. So I would put myself, in the kind of centrist camp, I guess, in U.S. foreign policy. I think both center-right experts, center-left experts, think American leadership is important, that the world we've built since World War II is worth defending. We face real enemies out there like the Russians and the Chinese that we need to defend against. We need to protect our allies. And I'm not sure that the extremes of either party buy into that. I think you're right that they think, actually, I heard a good quip on this recently, that for the far left, the problem is that America is too corrupt for the world, so we need to come home. For the far right, it's the world's too corrupt for the United States, so we need to come home.
Interesting. There are now more, in fact, than in previous years and previous centuries, second-tier powers of considerable size. And how do they play into this approach you're taking, or your theory? One certainly is Japan. Prime Minister Abe was trying to force Japan to rearm. I'm not sure he completely. He not changed the Constitution sufficiently to be able to do that, but he certainly has invested more in defense than any of his predecessors since the Second World War. Then you have India, which certainly is threatened by China and is growing closer to the United States. People used to say that George Bush was extremely unpopular around the world and all. That may well have been true in the Middle East and certainly in some European countries. but it was not true in India and half of Latin America, and it's not true at all in Africa. I mean, India, we had the highest approval ratings when Bush was president because he was attempting to create a alliance with India. How do you take these second-tier towers? How do they fit into this this analysis that you've made?
It's a good question, and it's a question I got from some peer reviewers early on in the process. And so I thought hard about it. You know, people said, well, what about Japan? What about Israel against its autocratic rivals? There were some questions raised historically about some of the second-tier powers. And in the end, I decided, I think I'm right in this, that it is the leading powers that set the, especially in alliance systems, that are kind of setting the tone. And so it's really hard to understand how Japan's democracy has helped its power and wealth, apart from the fact that it's, you know, been a part of this US-led international system with an American democracy as the leader. I think same thing with Israel. It's hard to understand Israel's flourishing over the past several decades without reference to the United States and the security order we've built in the Middle East and the aid we provide to Israel. So I think that would be an interesting question for a future study, but I thought, excuse me, kids here. But I thought for this study, really focusing on the superpowers and the makes a lot of sense, because I think it's hard to understand the growth in power and wealth or the failure of other countries without understanding the bigger structural incentives they're operating in. You know, it'd kind of be like, I think I maybe said this to a peer reviewer, it'd be like, if you're familiar with the details of the Peloponnesian War, it'd be like studying Athens versus Sparta from the point of view of Segesta. Like, yeah, it was a democratic power that was involved, but like really the action was Athens versus Sparta. So let's keep our eye on where the action is.
So there are areas of the world now that there's more rivalry between China and Russia than there is with us. For example, in Central Asia, I know Central Asian republics are very nervous about Russia's intention, because in the Duma, they referred the Central Asian republics as the colonies in Central Asia. They use very disparaging comments, and it enrages the Central Asian republics. But they now, I've talked to some of them, they're even more afraid of China. So is there a risk of China and Russia in conflict with each other, since they share an enormous border and they were almost at war in the 1980s? Should we be trying to, as a balance of power matter, trying to divide the two of them? How might we do that?
Yeah, interesting question. And in fact, I published a spin-off piece on this in Foreign Policy that I could maybe post in the chat. Because, you know, during the Cold War, the United States split Russia and China. We worked from China against Russia. And now there are people who say, kind of like you suggested, we should do the reverse Kissinger. We should work with Russia against China. So I basically don't think we should do that for a number of reasons. One, I'm not that worried about Russia and China forming a deep alliance. That's what some people are worried about, that, you know, they've conducted military exercises, they're engaged in some joint military production, that somehow they're going to form this counterbalancing coalition against the United States. And I think you're right that they have a lot of differences. I don't think there's a real danger of them forming an alliance. Also because autocracies aren't great allies. Even if Russia and China formed a formal alliance tomorrow, I think the chances are still better that they fight a war against each other than that they fight a war against us. Second, even if we could get Russia to work with us, well, I don't think Putin would do that. You know, he sees us as his foremost enemy. Why is he going to help us with the greatest challenge of the 21st century? Even if he said he would help us, why would we believe him? We don't trust him to do anything else. Also, Russia doesn't bring much to the table. It's less than 2% of global GDP. So I think the better approach is to work with our existing democratic allies in Europe and Asia to beat Russia and China at the same time.
China is taking over. I mean, I've seen it, and it particularly the last 4 years, but it even started under President Obama, not just President Trump, that the Chinese had an orchestrated strategy to take over international institutions And we see some of that in what happened with WHO, with Dr. Tedros. I know Dr. Tedros. I met him when he was health minister in Ethiopia. And by the way, he was the best health minister in Africa. And but he got elected with Chinese support, and some people believe that his failure to ring the alarm bell very early on may have made this worse, the pandemic worse than it already was. And now they're quibbling over what this report is going to be from WHO as to where the pandemic started. And then there's some evidence from a Harvard study that was done from remote sensing that the pandemic actually started in early September. And without going to the details of how they know that, it's very persuasive and Chinese scholars, actually scientists, were actually putting blogs out saying that. And some of Chinese scientists actually said it did start in that Wuhan, that was an accident or accidental release from the Wuhan BSL-4 lab, which is the highest rank of labs studying viruses and disease. These were Chinese scientists. And I was reading this stuff very early on, March of last year. I was astonished that it was, and immediately these scientists either disappeared or their blogs disappeared. All the stuff went off the internet. But I downloaded some of the stuff. It was fascinating to see. What about this? The Chinese appear to be doing what we had done for years and don't appear to be doing anymore.
Yeah, so I think this rules-based system that we and our allies built since 1945 has worked for the United States and has worked for the world. And I think we began to take it for granted, at certain periods in the 2000s, 2010s, even certainly the Trump administration, I think, wasn't quite sure, is the WHO, the WTO, is this helping the United States or not? And I think we saw what happens when we abandon these institutions, that then we open it up to competitive multilateralism, that China puts forward leaders, officials for leadership positions, and they bend the institutions to advance China's interest, oftentimes in ways that are directly contrary to the purpose of the institution. And so for me, the lesson is that we built this system, it worked for us, and it can work for us again. And so we need to start taking these institutions seriously again and make sure that we and our allies, kind of like-minded democracies, reassert our influence within these institutions. I think this will become another area, essentially, where this great power competition plays out.
Matthew, you've had a history of involvement in government itself, being an official in the government, advising the government, and of course, as a scholar. And one of our people who watch this or know of your work and your bio asked, when did you make the decision to do both? I think I remember being at Georgetown where they said, and by the way, this is also true of the Bush School, that if you don't have some government experience at Georgetown, people don't take you too seriously. That's very unusual because many universities, if you have experience, and you're not a pure scholar, they're suspect. And so you've had a dual track. Can you talk about that a little bit? What made you decide to do both?
Well, I sometimes joke with my students that I still haven't decided what I want to do when I grow up. And so if they're still figuring it out, that's okay. But, it's hard to be a good scholar. It's hard to be an effective policy, effective in the policy space. And so I sometimes feel like I'm doing both poorly. But, really, I was always a little bit more interested in policy, to be honest. And decided to go to graduate school because I wanted to have the credentials to work in policy. While I was in graduate school, I did some internships at in government and had hard decisions. Do I stay in government? Do I go back to school? And I thought, well, I'm doing okay in this PhD thing. I'll just go ahead and finish the doctorate and then figure it out. And then, as you know, the academic job market's very competitive. So I basically applied to every job in the country and thought I'd let the job market decide for me. And, if my best job was a place I didn't really want to go to, then maybe I'd go back to Washington. If I got a good job in the academy, I'd take it, and was fortunate enough to get a job at Georgetown. And so being a professor in Washington, D.C. Makes it much easier to do both because you can teach your classes in the morning and go meet with policymakers in the afternoon. In a sense, I have always enjoyed both and didn't want to decide. And in a sense, I got lucky.
I sometimes think they built that little highway from Georgetown University to the State Department just so we could go back and forth, because I was envoy to Sudan for President Bush while I was teaching. I went to see Jack DeJoy and said, "Do you have any objection?" He said, "Oh, no, Andrew, go ahead and do it. We want you to do both. Just make sure you teach the kids too," which I did do. But that little highway made it very easy. It took 10 minutes to go back and forth to the State Department. And,
amazing.
Yeah. So can you tell us whether you observe that autocracies act differently than democracies in the use of economic power and influence to enhance them personally, enhance wealth, which is one of the problems in China of corruption, but that's even truer in Russia. But also they seem to be more capable of targeting their economic power in a really remarkable way. Will Norris, one of our professors, has done a book on Chinese economic statecraft, and he's discovered these really unique, down to the county level, where they try to influence votes in Taiwan, for example. And I know they did. They shut off. We have a house up in Maine on a lobster fisherman's island. And I think the Chinese were attempting to influence the election. They shut down all lobster exports, was a huge amount from Maine to China. And I think it was trying to influence the outcome of the general election, because in Maine, they don't vote for the whole state in electoral votes in a presidential election. They split it by congressional districts. And I think they were trying to influence the Maine vote in this past presidential election. Don't they do better at that than us, targeting that specifically?
Well, that's interesting. And I know Will Norris, and I've known him for, a while now. I won't give away our ages, but so I don't think I've seen that study, so I should read that. But I don't want to overplay the argument. Democracies have weaknesses, autocracies have strengths. And I think one of the weaknesses is democracies are more open to external penetration. And I think that's always been the case. And I draw some parallels between, the Persians getting by the Greeks at the mountain pass at Thermopylae, to Russian interference in U.S. elections today. We're open, and that's why we're strong. But it also means it's easy for the enemy to get in and get behind our lines. On the other hand, I think autocracies also overplay their hand, and I think we're seeing that with Chinese economic coercion. And we've seen what they've done with the Australians, basically punishing them economically for their political positions. With the South Koreans, when the South Koreans deployed THAAD, China said, "Okay, that's fine, but we're shutting down South Korean grocery stores in China. We're prohibiting Chinese tourism to Seoul." So they really play hardball, and I think the free world is beginning to realize that there are downsides to being dependent on China economically. And so you're seeing these systematic discussions about decoupling from China. And just one good example, China says it wants to be the world's leader in technology. But what's happening with 5G, increasingly countries are saying, we don't trust Chinese 5G technology. We don't trust Huawei. I don't see how you become the world's technology leader if nobody trusts your technology. So I think we're in the early stages of the intense part of this competition. And I do think that China's at risk of overplaying its hand and pushing the rest of the world to work against it.
I've spent a lot of my time in Africa dealing with African issues, talking to African leaders. And I've talked with some of them about why they signed these agreements for the Belt and Road Initiative without reading the fine print. And they really get angry when they said, why didn't we read it? Because they're losing their ports. They're losing, Ecuador lost its oil fields. they're supposed to take the money and build this dam. The Chinese never built the dam, but they've lost control of revenues from their oil field. The Kenyans are losing control of Mombasa, their big port. And so a lot of African states, and there's 2 new books out on the Chinese aid program, which has not been well studied actually in detail. These do books, I haven't read them yet, but we ordered them to read because I'm doing this book on foreign aid, and it's a fascinating question. But there is a revolt going on. It's indisputable in Africa to Chinese dominance because of the fine print about what happens when you default on your loans.
That's fascinating. I didn't know the details of that in Africa. So would love to talk to you more about that. I was in Sri Lanka in the before times. I can't remember exactly, just before the shutdown. And that's another area where China's made major investments. And I was talking to some taxi drivers who are always the best source of wisdom about a country. And they said, look, we needed these ports, we needed these bridges, we need a highway. Before it used to take hours to go from this city to that city. Now it takes 20 minutes. So we needed this infrastructure, and America wasn't going to provide it. So I'm glad that China did. But now China's too involved in our business, too involved in our politics. So it came with strings attached. And Sri Lanka, as you might know, is another place where China said, has taken control of a port. Sri Lanka wasn't making the payments on the port, and so China just took it over. And some fear that this could become a Chinese military base, naval base. And so other countries around the world are seeing these debt traps. And Malaysia, I know, is one country who has said no to Belt and Road for this reason. They don't want China to lay a debt trap for them. So China's making some gains, but I think it's also making some enemies.
They're headwinds. Well, I think we're at the end of our time now, Matthew. Thank you for being with us. I think it's been a very good conversation, and we appreciate your the book. Buy the book so you can sell more copies, and we look forward to your new book.
Yes, well, it's available on Amazon if you want to check it out. I make like 10 cents per copy or something. So, but you spend all the time writing a book. You hope somebody other than your mother reads it. But thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you, Andrew, for the invitation. And I look forward to seeing you all on College Station sometime soon.
Thank you, Matthew.